Thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. It's 5:30 in the morning here, so it's morning for me. Good evening to you all, and thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion with you. And I guess I'm calling it a discussion because I believe that that's what it should be. I've gone back and forth a bit as to what to include in the discussion. And I suppose being a little bit disconnected from what's been happening more recently, I've tried to keep it fairly high level. But what I would encourage is, as we go through this discussion, if you've got any question or contributions, by all means, if you don't mind jumping in, that would be fantastic. I did want to start. I might just reshare my video here. Sorry, guys. I did want to start with a little video, I guess. We're talking about transport infrastructure planning. And, you know, when you think about planning, there's a risk of always thinking that, oh, look, we've always got time. There's always time to change. There's always time to do something different. We don't need to change what we're doing now because, you know, we all learned that, you know, we're inherently resistant to change. So I've got a I've got a cartoon up there that talks about digital transformation, because that's, you know, hit us in the face over the last year or so with COVID-19. And, you know, it basically says, you know, transformation is many, many years away. We don't need to change. And then COVID hit us and everything changed. The way we do everything changed. And, you know, the way we work changed, working from home. A lot of societies, a lot of companies that, you know, traditionally have been come to the office. This is where you need to be to do your job. Have had to make that change, you know, school, home as well. I guess, so it's changed our outlook and the way we think about things. And in terms of the transport system, so Guyana's got unique challenges, and it's a unique society, unique culture. And in some ways as well, the way development pattern has occurred is unique. But I guess let's bear in mind that many societies and many countries and many areas have undergone a similar progression over the years. But this transport system plan, the system is basically made up of a couple of levels. So we've got network. We've got a network level that overarches and covers everything or most of everything. And then on your overall network, we've got areas, we've got specific areas, and we've got specific corridors as well. And corridors can span areas, can span entire networks, depending on the size of the transport network. And within those corridors, we've got routes, we've got links, and we've got individual locations. And why this is important is we tend to, and it is not unique to the way we do things in Guyana. It's not unique at all. It's a challenge, and I guess it comes with maturity in the planning process, where it's easy to jump to a link or jump to a location and try and solve a problem at a location without thinking about, okay, so what's happening with the remainder of that route? What's happening with the corridor? How does it affect how people move in a local area or a wider area? And I suppose it's important to take that into perspective, that the things that we do have wide-reaching consequences and wide-reaching impacts as well. Anna, just confirming that you guys can see the screen. I should have asked that at the beginning.
Yes, it's raining, Moshin.
Yes. All good. Okay. All right. So is planning useful? I've had this question from friends who are also engineers. And what I've come to realize in my time working is, you know, we are all engineers and we're all planners. Some of us are adept to the long term, the big picture. Some of us can accept the things that we do may not eventuate for 15, 20 years, whereas some of us expect to see things happen now. And some of us can't fathom, you know, what happens in, not can't fathom, but don't enjoy doing the long-term big picture planning that, you know, you basically don't see the fruits of your work for many years. So I don't know, you guys, some of you might be fans of Dilbert, but I'm a fan of Dilbert, and a lot of what they have is very very appropriate for what we do. Um, and this one is, it goes to the heart of whether or not planning is important, and it being viewed that it's just a management thing. It's just something that we do because someone gets paid to do some planning. Um, but just bear in mind that it's useful and it's got its place in society. So transport, what is transport? So transport's a derived demand. Um, it is a product of everything that we do. People need to move, we need to go places, we need to move freight, we need to move services, we need to move goods. Freight is going to become more of an important issue in Guyana in the coming years because, with the oil and gas sector, it comes with development of light industries and so on, and they need to move equipment and they need to move things. So freight is going, on top of community demand, freight is going to be more important over the years. Transport does influence where we live and work. Personally, from a personal perspective, we've been where we've been for the last 5 years, and our decision was made based on how far we've got to travel to get to work, how long is it going to take to get the kids to school, and so on. And I'm sure everyone makes a decision as to where they want to live based on being able to get around and go places and do things. And one of the other things is transport does constitute a significant percentage of household expense. It takes up a lot of the household income. And it's something we often take for granted, how much of household income gets spent on the transportation function. And it varies. Developing countries with decent public transport, it can be lower. But in some developing countries with a less mature public transport system, it tends to be higher. So it all depends, and every system is a bit unique in that regard as well. And transport does require management of traffic mix. So we've got commuter, we've got freight, and even within freight, we've got different types of freight. So that's something that'll be developing in Guyana as time goes along. And for an efficient transport system, what we do is we respond to service needs. So if a need arises, we respond to it. We provide a change in that function or an upgrade on function. The other part of this is what is also important is that induced demand is real, and oversupply in a network, just like anything else, creates additional use and discretionary trips that wouldn't have ordinarily occurred. If there is capacity in the network, people tend to make that additional discretionary trip that they wouldn't have ordinarily made if the system didn't have additional spare capacity, I should say. So what should public infrastructure do? And at times, I suppose, as planners, as engineers, we really ought not to forget the purpose of public infrastructure. It's not for us, it's not for the politicians, it's for the public. It's also the public's money. It's also, even when we get grants and loans, it's the public's money that's used. It's taxpayers' dollars that gets used to pay for this. Even resources that belongs to the country, that belongs to the people. It gets used to pay for this infrastructure. So we need to remember, okay, who are we doing this for? It's to foster social and economic development. It needs to consider sustainability in the environment, and it needs to be resilient. And the resilience part of it is very important as well, because nothing goes wrong until it goes wrong, So, we ought to think about how resilient our network is, or how resilient are we making our network when we make changes. So the old question of planning versus reacting. So a problem arises, we jump in to fix it, and we all want to do the right thing. We all want to fix the problem so that we can move on and move forward with our lives. And the challenge is sometimes we can be chasing our tails to fix the problem. And in a planning perspective, it's important to understand the big picture. What is the big picture? What are we trying to achieve as a society? Where are we trying to go with our needs? How do we address current and future needs? How do we bridge the gap between where we want to be and where we are. So we need to understand the problem now and in the future. That will then allow us to respond to service requirements. So service requirements are important because service requirements are what feeds into setting objectives. So for example, a service requirement could be resolving congestion issues on the approaches to the Demerara Harbor Bridge, for example, or or addressing safety concerns on the East Coast and the East Bank Public Road, for example. So those are service requirements, and service requirements are required. It needs to be objective oriented. So we need to really clearly define what we're trying to achieve. And I'm saying being future ready, and I realize it sounds like a bit of a catchphrase, but how does what we do, how does it feed into where we're trying to go or what we're trying to achieve in the future? And in the long term, planning might seem wasteful, but if we've got a decent framework and we put the time and effort into it, it's cheaper than reacting, because in reacting, we don't quite capture all of the issues that we ought to address in the process. So key considerations. So there are economic development drivers, which we've talked about. There's population growth and demographics. So, where are people living? Where are they moving to? What are they doing? And what does the population constitute? So, at some point in time, Guyana's aging population is going to increase and people are going to need to get around, and we're going to change the way we travel. And that's going to become more important. And, we're probably sometime in the future going to start looking at public transport a bit differently. Kids getting around to school at some point in time as society changes. The notion of being able to get around and dropping kids off to school, people are going to start looking for more convenient ways of doing that, and that's where things like public transport come in. Then there's the land use planning component, so location of regional economic centers and regional economic clusters, and how the transport system needs to feed into land use. There's the location of current and future activity centers, which we've just mentioned. There are socioeconomic factors. So every society is a bit different. Expectations are different. Wealth distribution is different, and those need to be taken into account as well. There's a need for freight, and light industrial development is going to take off. It probably already has in Guyana. I mean, light industry is fairly significant already, but it will only increase, and that will drive a different demand for freight, and things like just-in-time freight will increase as well to service the oil and gas sector. And the last two, I've left those at the end, not because they're not important, but I think because they're often forgotten. And placemaking has got to do with roads move. It's a commuter and freight function. Roads, they move people, they move things. But I think we lose sight sometimes, and when I say we all do, lose sight sometimes of what the transport network is meant to do. And placemaking is basically saying there needs to be provision for everyone. And I understand that every transport corridor has got a different function. That, if there's a highway, you wouldn't provide certain things, but if it's a local road, you might. So placemaking is important to ensure that, we provide green areas and so on, that we provide amenities for society so that people can not only get around, but we're creating a livable environment as well. And asset management is also important, because what often happens is we create infrastructure that we cannot maintain. So it's not just about having a look at the maintenance cost during planning and thinking about, how much is it going to cost to, jack deck units on a bridge to replace the bearings, or how much is it going to, cost to resurface a section of road. It's much more than that. It's big picture, long-term asset management requirements to keep the infrastructure going. And as we start to get more public asset, it's going to increasingly become challenging and costly. So the rational questions that we'll ask, what is going on? Why did it arise? Who's affected? How much time and money is, it's being either lost in the process or required to fix the problem? What are the alternatives to fix the problem? And when do we take action? When does this need to happen? So these are all questions that we inherently ask as we go through the process. So Guyana's challenges. Now, where I work currently, we've got similar challenges to what's there in Guyana. I live in a coastal area, and Guyana's challenge. We were talking about everyone settled along the coast. I don't know. Last I remember when I was in school, it was 90%. I don't know if that has changed. 90% is settled along the coast within a certain distance from the Atlantic, and we've got geographic dispersion. We've got generally low densities of development. There are a lot of physical constraints, which makes building infrastructure expensive. We've got the coast, we've got the coastline, we've got rivers, we've got forests, and plus we've got other things as well going on. There are social factors and culture as well, that influences how people move and the decisions they make. Then there's driver behavior, which I know driver behavior always gets put up as the main, issue that influences decision making in transport provision. But that's something that we can talk about in the discussion as we move forward. There's a very high road crash and road fatality rate in Guyana as well, and that links back to driver behavior, the social factors, but it also links back to the infrastructure that's provided, the information that's provided as well. Then there's political expectations and funding, because like everywhere else in the world, election cycles are real. So that's not unique to Guyana. That's everywhere. It's just how do we react? How do we respond to those challenges? So what's next? So a lot of this is, some of this is my experience, and I'm sure we've got other transport professionals in the group. We've probably got urban planners in here as well, who would share, who may have, the same views. They may have slightly different views, but I'm hoping we can have a good discussion on this. But where to from here? So we really ought to we really ought to have a program development framework. So, how do we plan for investment? Where do we put our money? And how do we decide how to prioritize that expenditure? And that comes back to, okay, so how do we plan our program? We really ought to start thinking more and more. And I know there's been some of that already. We need to start thinking about regional economic centers and that whole decentralization discussion, but in a meaningful way. Clear network hierarchy. And I think this is an area where many developing countries struggle with trying to clarify network hierarchy, because that influences design standards, that influences where funding goes as well and how prioritization is done. Functional intent. So what's the functional intent of each corridor? Functional intent then influences design standards, and they need to be clear and achievable and appropriate for the local population, appropriate for construction materials that we've got, appropriate for the vehicle mix that we've got as well. And it's also important to start thinking about delivery mechanisms early. So we shouldn't wait until we're ready to deliver a project before we think about delivery mechanisms, as in, how are we going to fund projects and how are we going to deliver it? So formulating a framework. If anyone's got any questions here, it would be great for sorry guys, my screen just froze. Am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on, Moshin. We can hold off to the end if you want for questioning sometimes.
Sure.
But if there's anyone, if you would like to receive any questions now, it's totally up to you. But you can continue if you'd like. And
sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So formulating a framework. The societal governmental goals, the objective setting component is, it's the big picture. So what is government trying to achieve? What is the society trying to achieve? Where do we want to be in 10, 20, 30 years and beyond. What's the vision? What's the big picture? What's the long-term vision? That then allows us to set our objectives. And that really needs to come before we start thinking about our planning choices and our system planning, our transport system planning, because it doesn't only influence the transport system. It affects public policy in other areas, what we do, how land use, how land use pattern gets influenced, where do we need hospitals in the future, just all those things. They're important, they hang off of what is our vision, what's the big picture, where is society going. So the planning choices and the system planning, that links to, what is the problem and how do we fix the problem? And that's a bit of I wouldn't call it a loop, because, loop kind of insinuates that we're going around in circles. But that's an area sometimes that I think we don't. And it's not about spending a lot of time. It's about the effort. And it's about getting the right people involved at that stage. And we'll talk about that in a second. So we go through that process, and then we try and fix the problem, and then we assess success. And assessing success is important, because if we don't assess success, we start that whole process again for the next project off on the wrong foot, because we haven't really captured our learnings. So it is very important to capture our learnings as we progress through the process. So a popular framework, and it's one of the challenges in not just developing countries, but when funding's limited as well, or when time's limited, and when we really need to fix a problem, it needs to get done now. We rush through, we get a feasibility study done, someone makes a recommendation, we get a design done, we decide we're going to construct it, and then operations and maintenance is often an afterthought as well. But we forget, what's the big picture, what are we trying to achieve, and how does this link into everything else that we're doing? So saying that we're going to get stuff done, we're going to have stuff shovel ready, and it's going to be done right away, great, but how does that feed into the big picture? So what I do and what we do, and I know there's a process that's followed in Guyana, which unfortunately I haven't been around for a number of years, so I'm not fully across how it currently works. But I guess I've got thoughts around what a planning framework ought to look like. There's an ideal planning framework where you follow every step of the way when you've got time and when you've got funding and when there's a program development mechanism in place. The way it's done here, we've got in Queensland at least, and it's the same in some of the other states, well, all of the other states, is we've got basically every area's got a regional transport plan. So we've got a statewide, we've got a national plan, we've got a statewide plan, we've got a regional transport plan, and the local council's got a local government infrastructure plan as well that sets out what they're trying to do, how are they going to spend their money that they get over a number of years, because everyone gets audited and so on. And I suppose that's easier said than done, because there's a lot more funding. But there is no reason why we can't implement a process in Guyana that gives us that big picture, long-term view of the world, so that in 10 or 15 years, we haven't lost touch with where we were and where we want to go, and we can measure how far we've come. So having that big picture is important. It influences the policy choices and setting, direction setting and objective setting. And then we move on to the system planning. So we've got a policy in place, we've got a big picture in place. We can then reflect on how the system needs to operate, and how do we better link employment and activity centers. And from that, well, then we identify initiatives, whether they're infrastructure, whether they're non-infrastructure, policy choices, and delivery mechanism. Now, the whole infrastructure versus non-infrastructure option is very important. So when I say non-infrastructure, it doesn't mean that we're not building anything. It just means that we're not necessarily building anything new. One of the things that we jump past is how do we maximize what we've got right now? And a lot of developed countries and developing countries are going through that whole process of maximizing use of existing infrastructure. We call it sweating the asset. How do we sweat the asset to get as much as you can out of it? even if it means delaying investment for 5 or 10 years. So are there safety fixes, are there short-term fixes that are meaningful, that'll extend the life of the asset, that'll improve safety and so on, without having to do wholesale, uh, you know, large project construction. Um, so from those initiatives, we move into what's called the appraisal phase or the business case phase, where we do this very well in Guyana, where we go through, we don't call it a business case, we call it sort of feasibility study, but we tend to go through a long list and a short list of options, and then we do economic assessments and we come up with a recommendation. Um, the challenge though is, depending on where you sit in the process, it's not all equal. And depending on who you get to do that, to go through that process for you, with, whether it's a consultant, whether it's a large tier 1 consultant or an engineering firm or whatever it is, it's not all the same. Because if you get someone that's delivery focused, that builds things, they will give you a different outcome, because they're thinking about, okay, so how do we get out there and build this thing? They're not so concerned about how does this thing operate in 20 years, or where is society in 30 years, and does it still satisfy that need and that function. So if you start off on the wrong foot, you'll end up somewhere else than you intended. So once we've pulled together a business case, then we get into prioritization of investments and initiatives and delivery strategy, delivery mechanism. How are we going to deliver a project? Is it, if it's a small project, can the Ministry of Works, can they overlay a section of road? Do we need a private contractor in? Is it a design and construct project? Is it a triple P? And there are other mechanisms as well, which we'll talk about in a second. Sorry, everyone, I've been sick all week, so there's a bit of a struggle. So once we get through delivery, then we go through performance review and operations and maintenance. So O&M, it's something as well that requires a bit of effort, because often there's just a bucket of money, and let's maintain what we can with that bucket of money. But routine maintenance is a real thing as well, and it should entail some planning as well. But that's a topic that we'll cover in a subsequent discussion. So, what's this whole being objective oriented thing? How are we objective oriented? So, we need to keep focus on the outcomes that are being sought. How do we facilitate scope management? How do we set a clear path for approval to sign off? So how do we give whoever the responsible person is in the Ministry of Works or the Ministry of Health or wherever to sign off on a project? So we need to create that clear path to sign off and, manage expectations as well. And how do we allow progression to the big picture? So how does it feed into what we're trying to achieve as a society as a whole? So we've got our objectives on the left-hand side of that figure. So we've got our transport system objectives that gives us desirable outcomes. So that comes from your big picture. Where are we trying to get to? Where are we trying to go? Then we look at the existing network. What are the performance indicators right now? How is it actually performing? What's the safety performance? What's the operational performance? What are the needs? So basically, we bring that together. We do a gap analysis. So these are the issues that we're trying to resolve. These are the challenges that we've got currently, and then we move into basically that policy development, that advice development, or linking it back to the big picture planning. Then we move that into system planning and then individual initiatives. So it's a process that we really ought to follow to make good decisions. So let's just go back to the basics for a second. So we talk about capacity upgrades, and unfortunately, I can only go with photos that I've could find online. So things might have changed a little bit. So forgive me, guys and girls. So, this is a section of East Bank Road. I think it's, I think it's East Bank. Yes. And so I remember being a young engineer and working on with Walter Willis on the East Bank Road upgrade. And when we started the project, and I suppose, we all want to start out in construction because it's always, the best thing to do, get out and build stuff. A design was there. Consultant had done a design. Can't remember which consultant, might have been SNC. A design was done, and it looked at, what was required for the corridor. How do we provide, what do we provide at the intersections? Where do we need traffic signals? And how do we set this whole thing up on the East Bank? How do we set this whole thing up? And the project started, and someone had a great idea to stretch the funding and build some more stuff. Let's build some more stuff. We've got not the Olympics. We've got the World Cup coming up. Can we take this? Can we stretch the work down the East Bank? Can we do a little bit more? So obviously, we get to that loop between, what you can afford versus where you want to go versus the quality that you get. And compromises were made, various reasons, and we ended up with precedent setting on the East Bank Road. So why I say precedent setting, even, the issues that we've got with precast covers on box drains that are not even level, that are forming footpaths for people to walk and ride and whatever on. That precedent was set in that East Bank Road project when the contractor was allowed to do that. They asked, can we do that? Can we precast drain covers and bring them on site? The contract administrator said, yes, you can. And then, precedent was set. So those are the challenges that, comes back to design standards and objective setting. What are we trying to achieve in the long term? So can we improve the existing? Can we rationalize traffic lanes? Can we rationalize access points? Because inherently, so we call this a highway, we call these Bank Road highway, but there is poor access control. Not because we want poor access control, because that's how development has occurred over time. Things have naturally progressed. It's the same here in Australia. We've got roads where things have naturally progressed over time, and it's very difficult to then go and change how it's accessed. So limited access plans become more and more and more important for new infrastructure, new roads, which is why it's important to set out clear hierarchy when we starting new projects. So we need to rationalize access points. Most areas are grid oriented, so it's easier to rationalize access points. It also means less roads for, funding agencies such as basic needs. I don't know which agencies are, I don't know if CIMAP's around anymore. But it's also less main roads for them to have to upgrade as well on top of just local streets if we rationalize access points. Things like separated turn lanes at intersections, and signage and line marking is very important, and that's somewhere that tends to get compromised. Signage and line marking is not great, and I guess we need to remember that driving is a behavioral task. And in that behavioral task, people need information. And without information, then it's difficult for enforcement to happen. And it's difficult for decision-making to happen. And if you don't provide guidance, well, then it's very difficult to tell people they're doing the wrong thing, or very difficult to drive societal change. But enforcement too, and it's difficult, I know, enforcement. So I know a little bit about this project, and I guess, it's an example, it's a major project, and I guess I just wanted to have a quick chat around, this project, and some of you in the room might have more insight as to where this project's at and what's being done. But as far as I'm aware, we all know about the existing Demerara Harbour Bridge and the operation maintenance issues and the challenges there and the retractions and the traffic disruptions and so on, and when retractions can happen. And I think we can all agree that, geez, this thing has given us the life more than its expected life. We need to do something before it's too late. So here we've got a new Demerara Harbour Bridge, a new crossing that doesn't require retraction, as I understand it. So service needs. So what's the problem? There's congestion, there are delays, there's aging infrastructure there, high maintenance costs, retractions, and chaos. I've called it chaos, not congestion, because when a barge hits the bridge, well, then you can't get across, and I recall that happening, I think, last year. So how should it operate? How should the Harbour Bridge operate? The terminal intersections at each end, because we've got toll booths, because we've got poor capacity and you need to get through, it does create problems during the peak periods. Previous road planning basically said, when we looked at the East Bank and West Bank public roads, the upgrades there, it was, let's just provide some more storage. Let's just provide some more space for cars to queue. So it didn't really fix anything. All it did was get the cars off of the main road onto the approaches. But I'd imagine that that's long gone, and traffic probably queues on the approaches right now. So land use, all roads basically leads to the Harbor Bridge, because it's such a we've got such a decentralized way of doing things that we use certain corridors and people need to get between A and B and need to travel for everything. And then there's decommissioning, how and when. And decommissioning wouldn't have been something that would have necessarily been considered back then. And we made some decisions with the Burbage River Bridge as well because of cost for various reasons. But the challenge is when it becomes time to decommission the Burbage River Bridge, it's going to be a different future. It's going to be a different Guyana. We're going to have different needs. We're going to have different expectations. There are going to be different problems. And I think learning some lessons with decommissioning this bridge and the challenges being faced here to build a new bridge and decommissioning this one is something that we'll need to take note of, because eventually the Burbage River Bridge will go through the same process. And how are we forecasting demand? So what are we basing demand on? What are we basing our economic assessment on? How are we forecasting future needs? So what are the challenges with the new bridge? So there's incident management. So that's never going to go away with any structure of this sort. Anything that long that crosses that kind of natural barrier will require incident management plans. How are we going to deal with it? Then there's the operational management side of things. So how is the day-to-day operations going to be implemented, and how are we going to use technology to achieve that? So that's something we need to think about. Lane use management, variable speed limit signs, contraflow. How is the contraflow going to work? What are the real operational costs, and how is that going to feed into network resilience? What's plan B? Because 3 lanes has got its own challenges as well. So we've talked about this already, but things like electronic tolling and so on, I'm pretty sure that will be considered. But one of the things I wanted to touch on is just delivery mechanism and, a DNC versus a triple P, and how does that going to work? And that's probably something that's going to be worked out, but I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion there because I'm pretty much over time at the moment. So objective setting, so it needs to be based on functional intent, and it really ought to inform the design criteria and compare cherries with cherries. And the reason I've said that is the challenge with inviting separate tenders and separate designs is how do you then compare these? Because they're all different. They're all different delivery contractors. Like I said, they're concerned with delivery. There is no reference design. There is no guided tender process. So then it's harder for decision makers to decide what do we go with. So what then happens is you make a decision based on cost. And the challenge with making a decision based on cost is sometimes you're not lining up apples with cherries with cherries. So that's why we need to, objective setting needs to align with the big picture, and that delivery model is a big part of how do we manage the public interest and how do we manage risks, and who holds that risk. And we need to provide a basis for future performance, and deciding, okay, what does success look like? So I guess I was going to go through some of my personal experience, but I think we're probably better off spending our time having a bit of a discussion now, if that's all right. And if there's time at the end, I can go through this stuff, Anna.